My name is Sophie, and the moment my entire family collapsed into a single, unbearable truth happened in the break room of a marketing agency in Chicago, over a cup of coffee I never got to finish. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray October morning where the sky can't decide between rain and nothing. I had just finished a client call and was refilling my mug when my coworker Dana walked in, still unwinding her scarf, face bright from the cold outside. She smiled at me, dropped her bag on the counter, and said, "Hey, how was the party? Your mom looked so happy in the photos." I turned around slowly. "What photos?" Dana blinked. She reached for her phone without hesitation, pulled up Instagram, and there it was. My mother's account. A carousel of images from the night before. My father standing at the head of a long table, both arms raised, laughing the way he only laughed at family gatherings. My sister Natalie beside him, glowing in a red dress, a crown of baby's breath tucked into her hair. Relatives I hadn't seen in years filled every seat. Balloons, flowers, a custom banner strung across the back wall that read, "Welcome home, our shining star." Natalie had returned from her 2-year residency program in London. That much I knew. But nobody had told me there was a party. Nobody had called. Nobody had texted. And, from the number of people in those photos, the guest list had been carefully planned, catered, and coordinated for weeks. I set my coffee mug down on the counter and stared at the screen until the image blurred. Dana shifted her weight, clearly sensing she had stepped into something she didn't understand. "Oh, I just assumed you were there. You're tagged in the comments," I thought. "I wasn't there," I said quietly. She didn't push further. She grabbed her coffee and left me standing alone in the break room, the phone screen still lit in my hand. I spent the rest of the morning at my desk, not working. I scrolled through every photo twice. The table had to seat 30 people. My Uncle Frank had driven 4 hours from Indianapolis. My mother's church friends were there, the same women who had brought casseroles to our house when my grandmother was sick. My cousin Lena, who I spoke to on birthdays, was standing in the back row holding a glass of champagne, laughing at something my father was saying. All of them had been told. All of them had shown up, and not one of them had thought to ask where I was. I wasn't surprised. That was the worst part. I was devastated, but I wasn't surprised. It had always been this way. In the quiet, unremarkable way that only children who grow up invisible truly understand. Natalie had been my parents' story from the beginning. She was the one who won the science fair in 7th grade and had her trophy displayed on the mantel for 3 years. She was the one my father walked to school even after she was old enough to go alone, because he said she was too precious for the world to handle on her own. I was 18 months older and walked myself. I didn't ask for a different arrangement. I had already learned it wouldn't come. I graduated high school with a full scholarship to Northwestern. My mother called her sister the night I got the acceptance letter, but I heard her on the phone describing Natalie's dance recital performance from the week before. She mentioned my scholarship at the very end of the call, almost as a footnote. Oh, and Sophie got into Northwestern. Yes, the full one. Anyway, Natalie's instructor says she has real potential. I stayed quiet. I went to Northwestern. I built a career. I told myself it was enough to be seen by the world even if I was invisible at home. By 29, I had a solid title, a team I was proud of, and a 1-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park with a window that looked out over a courtyard where someone had planted an old oak tree. I was not unhappy. I had simply learned to carve my life out of spaces my family didn't occupy. And then Dana said, "How was the party?" And the whole careful architecture of that acceptance collapsed. I called my mother that evening. I sat in my car in the parking garage below my building and dialed her number, my hand steadier than my heartbeat. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Sophie." "Hi, I was going to call you this week." "Mom." My voice was even, measured. "Why didn't you tell me about the party?" There was a pause. Not the pause of someone caught off guard, but the pause of someone deciding how much to admit. "We thought it might be uncomfortable for you," she said finally. "Natalie just got home, and she was emotional, and we didn't want any tension. You know how things get between the two of you." I pressed my fingers against my forehead. "There is no tension between us, Mom. I haven't even spoken to her in 3 months. There's nothing between us." "You're always so negative around her, sweetheart." You can't help it, I think. It's just the dynamic. You've always been competitive. The word competitive hit me with a familiar, nauseating precision. That was their word for me whenever I pushed back on anything, whenever I raised my hand in a room that wasn't expecting it. Competitive, difficult, too much. I was never competing with anyone, I said, keeping my voice low and careful. I just wanted to be included. She's my sister. My mother sighed. The long, performative sigh she deployed whenever she felt a conversation was beneath her patience. Sophie, it was a family dinner. We just didn't want drama. I went very still. Drama, I repeated. You know what I mean. No, I said. I don't, because I have never caused drama at a family event in my life. I show up, I eat, I leave. That's all I've ever done. What drama are you protecting everyone from? She didn't answer directly. She said Natalie was tired from the flight. She said the guest list got complicated. She said sometimes these things just happened, and I needed to understand that family gatherings had a certain energy. And my energy, well, I stopped listening somewhere around the second sentence. I had heard this script before. My energy. The implication that my mere presence was a contamination, a risk, something to be managed and contained. I have to go, I said. She was still talking when I ended the call. I sat in the parking garage for a long time after. The engine off, the concrete walls gray and close around me. I had thought I was past this. I had spent years telling myself that I didn't need their applause, that the life I had built was evidence enough of my own worth. But something about seeing that banner, "Welcome Home," our shining star with 30 relatives raising their glasses in the same room where I had never once been made to feel like I belonged, undid something very specific inside me. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen. I went upstairs and opened the door to my apartment and sat on the couch for a long time in the dark before I reached for my phone again. Not to call anyone, just to look at my left hand, the way I sometimes did when the world felt uncertain. The ring was a simple oval diamond set in gold. My boyfriend had given it to me 4 months earlier, on an ordinary Friday evening, standing in the kitchen of his apartment while pasta boiled on the stove behind us. He had not made a production of it. He was not a man who performed for audiences. He had simply said, "I've known you were it for me since the third time we had coffee and you argued with me about supply chains for 45 minutes and I thought, I want to argue with this person forever." And then he had opened a small velvet box and looked at me like I was the most specific and wonderful surprise he had ever encountered. I had said yes before he finished the sentence. His name was Marcus, and his family ran a logistics consulting firm out of Boston. His mother was a former federal judge who had built her career on precision and principle, and who had taken one look at me over Thanksgiving dinner, asked me 3 pointed questions about my work, and then announced to the table that I was the most competent person Marcus had ever brought home. She was not a woman who gave compliments carelessly. I had cried in the bathroom afterward because I hadn't understood until that moment how starved I was for someone to say something like that about me out loud. My parents had met Marcus twice. Both times my mother had spent the majority of the conversation asking about Natalie's residency program. I twisted the ring slowly and thought about how they still didn't know we were engaged. They hadn't noticed, or they hadn't cared to look. Marcus came home that night to find me sitting on the couch with the lights off, and he didn't ask what was wrong right away. He sat beside me first, put his arm around my shoulders, and waited until I was ready. When I told him about the party, about the banner and the 30 guests, and my mother's word drama, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They excluded you from your own sister's homecoming party and explained it by calling you the problem." Yes. He was quiet again for a moment. Then, "Sophie, you have done nothing wrong. Not tonight, not ever. You understand that." I leaned my head against his shoulder. My throat was tight in the way it got when I was trying very hard not to cry in front of someone I loved. "I know," I said. "I just keep thinking about 30 people who all knew and came, and nobody, not one of them, texted me." He pulled me closer. "Then those 30 people can answer for themselves. We don't need any of them." A week passed. I kept going to work. I kept answering emails and sitting in meetings and making decisions about campaign strategy. And nobody who saw me during that time would have known that every evening I came home and sat very quietly for a few minutes before I could bring myself to be normal again. Then my father called on a Friday afternoon. I almost didn't answer. But something in the way his name appeared on my screen, the flat, familiar font of it, the way it still prompted a flicker of hope I hadn't fully extinguished, made me pick up. "We need to talk about the house," he said. My parents had lived in the same house in Evanston for 26 years. My grandmother had left it to both my parents and, upon their passing, to Natalie and me equally. My name was in the will. I had seen the documents. "What about it?" I said. He was businesslike in the way he always became when he had already decided something and just needed me to catch up. He explained that Natalie was back in the country now, that she had been offered a research position at a hospital in Evanston, and that it made sense, practical, familial sense, for her to have stability. The house was large enough for her. The neighborhood was where she had built her roots. He had spoken to their attorney. "We'd like you to sign over your share," he said. "It's the right thing for the family." I sat very still at my kitchen table and looked at the wall. "You didn't invite me to her party," I said slowly. "And now you're asking me to give up my inheritance." "Sophie." "No." The word came out more quietly than I expected. "No. You excluded me from a family celebration. You told my mother I would cause drama, and now a week later you're calling to ask me to sign legal documents. Do you understand how this looks?" His voice shifted into the tone I knew from childhood. The one that said, "You are overreacting, and your overreaction is the problem. It isn't about the party. The two things are separate. They're not separate to me. Natalie needs stability. You have your career, your apartment. I have those things because I built them myself," I said. Without any of the head starts or celebrations or attention that Natalie received her entire life. And now I'm supposed to hand over the one thing that's legally mine because she needs stability? What did I need, growing up? Did anyone ask? The silence on the line was long. "You've always made everything about yourself," he finally said. "That's exactly why we didn't invite you to the party." I stood up from the table. My hands were shaking, but my voice stayed steady. "I'm not signing anything. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't call me again until you have something real to say." I hung up. I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the courtyard for a long time. The oak tree had lost most of its leaves by then. The branches were bare and clean against the white sky. I thought about how many years I had spent trying to fit into a story they had already finished writing without me. How many dinners I had attended, hoping this time someone would ask how my week went. How many phone calls I had returned promptly, dutifully, still believing that effort would eventually be repaid in kind. The next morning I opened Instagram and found a new post on my mother's account. She had written a long caption beneath a photo of herself and Natalie at a brunch table, both of them smiling warmly at the camera. The caption talked about the pain of being misunderstood by the people you love most. It talked about doing everything possible to keep a family together. It talked, very carefully, about a daughter who had chosen distance over connection, who had turned away from the family that loved her, who had been offered olive branches she refused to take. She did not use my name. She didn't have to. Every person who knew us knew who she meant. The comments were swift and sympathetic. Her church friends offered prayers and heart emojis. A neighbor who had watched us grow up said she was sorry, that she didn't know, that she had always thought we were such a close family. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 6 years sent me a private message asking if I was okay and whether I had really stopped talking to everyone. My hands were cold as I read through them. The nausea was familiar, the specific sick feeling of being made into a villain in a story you didn't recognize, told by someone who smiled sweetly in every photo. Marcus saw it before I said anything. He came into the kitchen that morning and looked at my face and said, "What happened?" I showed him the post. He read it carefully, twice, and then set my phone down on the counter. His jaw was tight. "My mother is going to call you today," he said. I looked up. "What?" "I texted her last night about what your father said. About the house." He met my eyes. "She's not the kind of person who reads something like that and stays quiet." His mother called me at noon. Her voice had the clean authority it always carried, unhurried and precise. She told me she had read the post. She told me she had seen this pattern before in other families, in courtrooms, in the complicated architecture of how people protected themselves by dismantling others. She said she was not going to sit by while someone she considered family was publicly described as a problem to be managed. "I want you to hear this clearly," she said. "You have done nothing to be ashamed of. And if your parents continue to use social media to misrepresent your character, I will make sure the right people know the truth." My throat was so tight I could barely speak. "I don't want a war," I said. "I know." Her voice softened. "But sometimes people need to understand there are consequences to what they choose to do. You've been absorbing consequences your entire life. Let someone else hold a little of that weight." She called my mother that afternoon. I don't know exactly what was said, but the post was gone by evening. No apology, no explanation, just gone, deleted like it had never existed. The silence that replaced it felt different from any silence I had known from them before. It felt, for the first time, like a boundary they had been made to respect rather than one I had simply failed to enforce. That night, Marcus and I sat on the couch together, his arm around me, the city lights just visible through the window. He told me his mother had said I was the kind of person who deserved to be protected. I cried then, not from sadness but from the specific relief of being fought for by someone who had no obligation to do it. The weeks that followed were quieter. I went back to work. Marcus and I began making real plans, not just the dream talk of the engagement period, but the concrete kind. Venue research, guest lists, the specific, deliberate act of choosing who deserved to be in the room. His mother offered their family property in Vermont, a sprawling old farmhouse on 40 acres with a barn that had been converted for events 20 years earlier. She described it plainly. Good light, ancient maple trees, room for 60 people if needed. She said it was ours if we wanted it. The offer was so generous I sat with it for 3 days before I could accept without feeling like I might fall apart from gratitude. We began drafting the list together, Marcus and I, at the dining room table one Sunday with coffee going cold beside us. Every name was chosen deliberately. My best friend from college, 3 colleagues who had become real friends over years of shared work, Marcus's family, warm and present in the way I had stopped believing families could be. My aunt, who had driven to Northwestern for my graduation when my parents arrived late and left early. My grandmother's old neighbor who had known me since I was 7 and had always treated me like I was worth knowing. My aunt cried when she got the invitation. She called me immediately, her voice thick, and said she had been waiting 20 years to receive something like that from my side of the family, and she was going to wear the most beautiful dress she owned, and she was not going to apologize for dancing. I laughed, genuinely and easily, in a way that surprised me. Some nights I still lay awake. Not from doubt, but from the old familiar ache of things that had already been decided long before I was asked. I thought about the banner with my sister's name on it, the 30 guests who never texted. My father's voice, flat and certain, telling me I had always made everything about myself. My mother's caption, so carefully written, so practiced in its innocence. Marcus would reach over in the dark and hold my hand without asking why. One evening he said, "Are you thinking about them? Whether they should come?" "No," I said. And it was true. I had crossed that particular threshold weeks before, quietly and alone, standing at my kitchen window looking at the bare tree. The people who had excluded me, dismissed me, and then attempted to erase me from the public record when I refused to comply, those people had already answered the question without my help. The invitations went out on a crisp November afternoon. I dropped them in the mail one by one, each envelope cream-colored with clean black script, each one carrying the specific weight of a choice made without guilt or apology. The pile was small. It was exactly the right size. The wedding was held on a Saturday in late March, the maple trees just beginning to show the first pale green of new leaves. The Vermont air was cold and sharp and smelled like wood and wet earth. String lights had been threaded through the branches overhead, and the barn was warm with candlelight and the sound of people who genuinely wanted to be together. My aunt arrived 2 hours early and immediately began helping rearrange the centerpieces. She cried at the altar, exactly as promised, pressing a tissue to her face with one hand and gripping her champagne flute with the other. Marcus's mother stood in the front row in a dark green dress and watched the ceremony with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew things were unfolding as they should. When Marcus and I walked back down the aisle together, the applause rose up into the rafters and seemed to lift with it something I had been carrying for a very long time. At dinner, my aunt gave a toast. She stood with her glass raised and her voice only shook once, at the very beginning, before she steadied herself and said, "I have watched Sophie move through this world quietly, and with more grace than anyone had a right to expect given how little she was given to work with. Tonight I am standing in a room full of people who chose to be here. And I want to say, this is what family actually looks like. It looks like this." The room was warm and full and nobody disagreed. Later in the evening, when Marcus pulled me onto the dance floor, I caught my reflection in the dark window of the barn, a woman in a white dress, lit from behind by 100 small lights, surrounded by people who had driven hours and booked hotels and cleared their calendars to witness this one specific day. I looked nothing like the girl who had sat in her car in a parking garage, scrolling through party photos she hadn't been invited to, trying to understand what she had done wrong. 2 months later, I was at work when my sister called. I almost let it go to voicemail. I hadn't spoken to her since before the party, her party, the welcome home celebration I had watched unfold through Instagram photos. But something in the repeated ringing, the specific persistence of it, made me step into the hallway and answer. Her voice was different than I remembered. Thinner, careful in the way voices get when someone is trying to appear less desperate than they are. She said the hospital position hadn't worked out. She said there had been some complications with her research visa, a funding issue, a restructuring in the department. She was vague in ways that suggested the story was more complicated and more her fault than she was willing to say. She was back in Evanston. She was living with our parents temporarily. And she needed help. She had been applying for positions in Chicago and needed someone with industry contacts, someone who could make introductions, someone who understood how these networks worked. I stood in the hallway of my office building and listened to the full length of her explanation without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "I'm sorry to hear that. I hope things become clearer for you soon." She paused. She had expected something else, refusal, maybe, or enthusiasm, but not this particular calm. "Sophie, I'm asking if you can help me." "I know," I said. "And I'm asking you something first. Where were you the night my mother posted that caption about me? The one that called me difficult and distant for everyone in her church group to read. Did you ask her to take it down? Did you say anything?" The silence was long. "It wasn't that simple," she said finally. "It was, actually," I said. "And when our father called to ask me to sign over my share of the house, did you know about that?" Another silence. "I thought it made sense," she said quietly. "I needed a place to—" "I know what you needed," I said. "I know exactly what you needed. You needed a place to land after every door closed, and our parents decided I was the most convenient thing to move out of your way." Again, I paused. "I'm not able to help you right now. I hope you find what you're looking for." I ended the call and walked back to my desk and sat down and opened my laptop. A colleague passing by asked if everything was okay. I thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, and said yes. I think it actually is. Spring came fast that year. The oak tree in my courtyard put out new leaves earlier than I expected, a sudden bright green appearing almost overnight. I made a habit of looking at it in the mornings with my coffee, watching the way the light moved through the branches differently each day. One Saturday in April, a small package arrived at our apartment. Marcus carried it in from the doorstep and set it on the kitchen table, curious. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, the return address handwritten, the handwriting belonging to my aunt. Inside was a framed photograph of the wedding. Not the official portrait, but a candid shot someone had taken near the end of the evening, Marcus and I on the dance floor, both of us mid-laugh at something the other had said. The barn lights behind us like a scatter of stars. My aunt, visible in the edge of the frame, looking at us with the expression of someone watching something they had waited a long time to see. There was a card tucked behind the frame. My aunt's handwriting, compact and deliberate. "For the record, I always knew you were the kind of person worth showing up for. I just had to wait for the right invitation." I held the card for a while, standing in the kitchen with the April light coming through the window. Marcus came up behind me and looked over my shoulder at the photograph, and I heard him make the small, quiet sound he made when something moved him. I thought about the banner. Welcome home, our shining star. I thought about 30 guests and one missing seat. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone saying the word drama like it explained everything, and my father's voice saying you've always made everything about yourself, and the Facebook post that had been there one morning and gone by evening. I thought about how none of those things had the power anymore that they once had. Not because I had stopped caring, exactly, but because I had built something around me that they couldn't reach people who chose to show up, who drove hours and cried at toasts and sent framed photographs with handwritten notes on a Saturday morning for no reason except that they wanted me to know they had been paying attention. I set the card gently on the counter and looked out at the courtyard. The oak tree was fully green now, dense and sure of itself, the branches full of something that had been quietly growing all winter while everything else was bare. I pressed my palm flat against the kitchen window and felt the cool glass and the warm light at the same time. Sometimes the people who are supposed to see you never will. Sometimes you wait a long time to understand that the waiting itself was the cost, and that the only way forward is to stop paying it. I had spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, achieved enough, they would one day turn around and finally recognize what had always been there. They didn't. They chose a different story. But I was standing in my own kitchen, in my own apartment, in my own life, a life built on my own terms with people who had come freely and stayed freely and loved me without conditions I had never agreed to. That, I had finally learned, was the only kind of belonging worth having. If you've ever been left out of your own family's story and had to build something better from the outside in, share what that looked like for you. And if this found you at the right moment, I hope it helped.